Good morning. Thank you so much, Tom, for that lovely introduction. On behalf of the National Gallery, I can say how grateful I am that Sargent and Spain has its second and final venue here at the Legion of Honor. Absolutely delighted to have worked with Emma so closely, who's a wonderful colleague. Couldn't ask for a better colleague to coordinate every aspect of the showing of Sargent and Spain here at the Legion, and to Tom, of course, and to all of your colleagues here at the Fine Arts Museums. Very, very grateful for everything. And Tom has introduced Richard and Elaine to you. I'm very thrilled to have worked with them for 5.5 years, I think, on this project, which was at the National Gallery. The exhibition was held at the National Gallery of Art from October 2nd to January 2nd. So the first venue, this is the second and final venue. And a quick note of recognition to my wonderful colleague, Catherine Southwick, who's here also from the National Gallery this morning and today, and she has been a pleasure to work with on this exhibition. So happy that she could join us as well. Richard Ormond proposed this exhibition in the spring of 2017, when I'd recently arrived at the National Gallery of Art from the Corcoran Gallery of Art, as Tom mentioned, and as I was beginning to explore possible exhibition topics. Richard and I had collaborated on the 2009-2010 exhibition called Sargent and the Sea at the Corcoran, which also traveled to the MFA Museum of Fine Arts Houston and the Royal Academy in London. Richard and Elaine have been fantastic collaborators together. So right about the same time that I was thinking about possible exhibition ideas for what I wanted to work on, as I was newly arrived at the National Gallery, I was going through our Sargent holdings, looking at the paintings, reading all the files on the paintings, and Richard was coincidentally in touch right about that time in the spring of 2017, and the project was born. Richard and Elaine, the three of us, have collaborated on the exhibition, as Tom mentioned. Together we shaped the show and its catalog, researching, meeting, traveling, selecting and seeing works we wanted to include, writing the catalog, editing the catalog. Of course, it's not surprising to mention that COVID made us pivot suddenly in spring of 2020, when we suddenly had to stop traveling and seeing works that we wanted to borrow, had to stop traveling to do research and that kind of thing. But thanks to the patience and collaboration of Richard, Elaine, Catherine, and our team at the National Gallery, we were able to obviously carry out the preparations for the exhibition that you will see today. A brief word about structure. I'll provide a very short overview of Sargent's life and career, followed by, again, a very short overview of the exhibition itself, which I trust some of you have seen already this morning or you will see later today. And the main part of the program will comprise a discussion about the exhibition that Emma will moderate. If we have time at the conclusion, I'm sure we'll be happy to answer questions. And with that, I will move ahead. Here's John Singer Sargent at about age 24 in Paris, a quite assured young painter, as I think you can see on the screen. And it was about this time that Sergeant Henry James referred to the slightly uncanny spectacle of a talent which on the very threshold of its career has nothing more to learn. Imagine that being said about a 24-year-old painter by Henry James. Clearly, there was a lot more to come after that. Sargent was born in Florence, Italy, during the European travels of his American parents. Fitzwilliam Sargent, who you see at the left, who was an eye surgeon in Philadelphia. Fitzwilliam's wife, Mary Newbold Singer, who was an amateur artist and very busy mother of 6 children, only 3 of whom, John, his sister Emily, 1 year his junior, and Violet, 14 years, John Singer Sargent's junior. Only the 3 of those Sargent children lived to adulthood. Fitzwilliam and Mary were, and you see Emily and Violet at the right of your screen. Fitzwilliam and Mary were inveterate travelers, left Philadelphia to move to Europe and simply never returned to Philadelphia. Traveled around with the seasons, made their homes, for example, in the south of France during the winters, the north of France during the summers, traveled different places, taking the cure, as it were, as it was very common at the time to travel around for traveling in Europe. Emily, whose watercolor actually from the National Gallery of Art's collection that you see on the left. As you can tell, Emily was like her brother John, her 1 year older brother John, was a watercolorist and often traveled quite often with John, actually. They were great friends, very close in age, traveling companions. And at the right, you see Emily sketching in Egypt, watched by Violet Sargent. A little side note here, the National Gallery, the watercolor at the left is one of about 23 watercolors that the National Gallery of Art acquired just before the pandemic in 2019. And those are 23 of a group of several hundreds of watercolors by Emily Sargent that had been discovered, I think, in about 1898 in a trunk under a bed in a bed of a family member, a descendant of John Singer Sargent. Richard and Elaine subsequently cataloged those watercolors, and Sargent's family, his extended family, descendants, including Richard, made very generous donations to the National Gallery of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Tate, and other institutions with very significant Sargent holdings. So we're very thrilled to have works by Emily in our collection. Then, so Sargent, sorry, I think I went too fast. Excuse me. Fitzwilliam and Mary supported their son John's aspirations, and he received instruction in Florence and Paris. His parents and sisters, his parents were of modest means, as I mentioned, became permanent expatriates. And this painting on the screen in the National Gallery of Art's collection, formerly in the Corcoran collection, where I had been curator for many years, was one of the very early exhibition successes of the young John Singer Sargent. It's from 1878, when Sargent was just 22 years old, and just was painted just the year before Sargent's first trip to Spain, so and was exhibited to great acclaim. Then in 1884, when Sargent's painting of Madame X, or Virginie Gautreau, Madame Pierre Gautreau, as you can see on the screen, when this painting was shown in 1884, at that time exhibited with one gown strap down, later repainted by Sargent, but when it was exhibited publicly at the Paris Salon with one strap down, and for other reasons that you might be able to determine from this painting, the painting shocked the French public and changed the course of Sargent's career. More importantly, it was an ambitious painting, influenced by Velasquez, to be sure, and also rather mannerist in style. Carnation Lily Lily Rose from 1885-1886 was painted by Sargent as he was getting ready to move to London. He spent some time in the Cotswolds after the Madame X incident, I suppose we could call it. Sargent didn't have too many portrait commissions, and he was trying to figure out a new course of action. Carnation Lily Lily Rose was seen to be more progressive than Sargent's art in Paris, and was, in a sense, a blend of Impressionism and British aestheticism. So Sargent relocated to London for a fresh start within a few years. Madame X, El Jaleo, that we will return to in a few moments, and Carnation Lily Lily Rose were really sort of one-offs, paintings that sort of came out of the blue, but they sort of appeared as if out of nowhere. Mrs. Hugh Hammersley, you see on the screen, this painting was the one that reestablished Sargent's reputation when it was shown in London in 1892. I should also note that it was around this time that Sargent received an important commission, which was to paint murals for the Boston Public Library, called The Triumph of Religion. You'll see those referenced in the Sargent and Spain exhibition. Those murals occupied Sargent from 1890 to 1919, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. These two paintings, Nonchalant and Simplon Pass, also from the National Gallery of Art's very rich holdings, were painted in the same year, 1911. It was after about 1900, Sargent had largely relinquished the grueling demands of painting commissioned likenesses. No more portraits, that's P-A-U-G-H-T-R-A-I-T-S, he wrote emphatically to his friend Ralph Curtis in 1907. Not only that, Sargent goes back to figure and landscape painting to find new energy. And Sargent began also to make a remarkable, very large group of charcoal portraits that is now the focus of Richard Ormond's endless energy, I should say, so he might say a little bit more about that later. So I'm going to shift gears just for the next couple of minutes, just to give you a very quick overview of the exhibition. Here is a map of Sargent's travels. As you can see, he went to Spain 7 times as an adult. We very strongly believe that he went once as a teenager, but all of these times as an adult, traveled all over the country. This is not a person who was just a sort of dilettante traveler, going one place, leaving, not doing much. This is a traveler with great intentions, as you can see from all of the places that he traveled on this map, north, south, east, west, and to the island of Majorca. The exhibition opens, as those of you who have been in it have seen, with, on the topic of Sargent studying the art of Velasquez in the Museo del Prado, and also the art of Goya and El Greco, that was his triumvirate of revered Spanish painters that Sargent loved so much. Then goes on to focus on Sargent and music and dance. Sargent was a very talented musician. He played the piano, played very difficult piano compositions, and at one point actually thought he might become a concert pianist had he not continued with his painting. Loved music, loved flamenco, loved Spanish dance, as you'll see in the exhibition. Just showing a couple of images here. In a section of architecture and gardens in the exhibition, Sargent paid particular attention to the Alhambra, the famous royal palace in Granada, in Andalusia, in the south of Spain. Spent quite a little bit of time there on several visits to Spain and created remarkable paintings of that structure. And also painted the scenes of everyday life of people living in Spain. Here, some washerwomen, some people at the right shucking corn, if you can see at the far right. Little girl with her doll in the foreground, women in the foreground and the background washing. Everyone's covered, everyone's in the shade of this remarkable, lush grape arbor overhead. And Sargent's 2 trips to Majorca in 1908 produced such remarkable oils like this one of a fisherman whose name we don't know, whose nets are drying on the railing behind him. He's a fisherman with swagger, that's what I like to call him. He's being shaded by this very typical roof of a hut, a fisherman's hut, where he is in between his fishing duties, and the remarkable patterns of light and shadow in this painting. The final section of the exhibition addresses, as I mentioned a few moments ago, Sargent's work, Sargent's great interest in religion in Spain, religion and spirituality in Spain, particularly in the rituals, altarpieces, figures, architecture, sculpture of Spanish Catholicism, seen very strongly in the south of Spain, in Sevilla and Granada, for example. This fantastic watercolor from the High Museum showing a figure in a niche in the great, very large altar in a monastery in Granada. And with that, I will join my wonderful colleagues up on the stage and we'll talk a little bit more about the exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that wonderful overview. And just to say what an absolute joy and honor it has been to work with you and all of you on this magnificent exhibition. We are so delighted to present it here at the Legion of Honor, which I'll just add, I think, is a very appropriate setting for the show, given our very rich holdings of art made in Spain, which I encourage all of you to take a look at in the upstairs galleries when you have a moment. Some examples, the 17th century polychrome likeness of St. Francis of Assisi that's attributed to Bernardo del Rincon that you see at the upper left. Examples of work by the great El Greco on view in Gallery 5, an artist whom Sargent greatly admired, as we'll see. And last but not least, the stunning Spanish ceiling from the Palacio de Altamira, installed in Gallery 3, that has this very intricate synthesis of classical and Islamic and Christian styles and motifs that are very characteristic of the aesthetic of the art and architecture found throughout Spain, and that really profoundly inspired Sargent and many of the works in the exhibition. So just to kick off our conversation, I think I'll start with a question that has occurred to me on quite a few occasions of late. Sargent, of course, is really known for his cosmopolitanism. We've just seen how widely he traveled in general, and there have been other exhibitions and books dedicated to considering the influence of various locations on his work. But this is the first exhibition to explore the influence of Spanish culture on his visual practice, and I find that kind of astonishing. It's great to be a pioneer in this, but considering, as Sarah just mentioned, how frequently he visited over a period of 33 years, 7 visits over 26 different cities and towns, and then you see the remarkable body of work that resulted from these journeys in the exhibition. Why do you think it has taken until now to really explore this incredibly important chapter of his life and career?
I think it's only recently that all the bits have been put together. People knew about Velasquez, they knew about the Spanish dance, but all the other aspects of it, the architecture, the gardens, the spirituality had never really been explored. And I think it's also a reflection, I think, of the fact that Spain was little less well known than Italy and France, and somehow that continued. And so it's only when one really began to look and think, good Lord, about 200 Spanish pictures, it's actually rather significant, and that it wasn't just fleeting visits, that he was really embedded in Spanish culture, and in a more profound way than some painters who came and visited, and because it was colourful and picturesque. But that's not really Sargent's take on it.
And I think you mentioned that many of these works have not been publicly viewed before. That this is their debut in a public setting.
Yes, for instance, that wonderful panorama of the Sierra Nevada is hardly known at all. It's been in a private collection, and that's true of some of the other pictures, that they have been tucked away. And so but I think that's what's exciting about Sargent, that he's so multifaceted, that you can approach him from a number of directions. And I think it's marvelous that the Spanish connection has really been brought out for the first time in any great depth or detail.
I think it's marvelous too, and I'm sure all of you would agree, having hopefully seen the exhibition by now. So let's talk a little bit about Sargent's early artistic training. I'm showing you a portrait here of his Parisian teacher, Carolus Duran, that I believe he made at the young age of 23, incredibly virtuosic. How does Carolus Duran fit into the narrative of Sargent and Spain?
Well, Carolus Duran was a friend of... Thanks. Carolus Duran knew Edouard Manet very well. Edward Manet was a hero to the younger generation of French artists, and Manet had gone to Spain in 1865, and he was just bowled over, particularly by Velasquez, whom he called the painter of painters. There was the way that Carolus taught art was to sort of diminish the importance of drawing, and he encouraged his students to paint au premier coup, à la prima, so at the first touch, without a lot of reworking. And I think that Velasquez was a model for the younger generation because he seemed to fit in with their kind of more modern imperative, moving away from the sort of model of the Italian Renaissance towards the individual touch of the brush, because Velasquez's brushwork is quite visible, it's quite individual, and young artists responded to that very much, and Carolus encouraged them to. He said all the time, Velasquez, 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 ceaselessly study Velasquez.
It's also just worth saying that Sargent did go to the École des Beaux-Arts. He was jolly well grounded in the essentials, so that there's Carolus Duran by day, but in the evening, he's at the École and doing life drawing. And of course, that all comes out later in the murals. These are complex academic murals, of course, lit up by Sargent's originality, but he jolly well knew his basics as well.
And here we see this wonderful logbook from the Prado Museum in Madrid, which allows us to really document the works that Sargent copied there. He was registered as a copyist in 1879 and 1895, I believe. And you see at right an image of artists in the galleries making copies. So it was really Carolus Duran who encouraged him to make this kind of pilgrimage of sorts and to visit the Prado.
Yes, and he wasn't the only one. I mean, there was a steady stream of French artists and other foreign artists making their way. The other great place you went to was to the Frans Hals Museum, because Frans Hals was the other great hero, another great bravura artist of the brush. And between the two of them, so Sargent, of course, after the Prado in Madrid, it was Harlem and Frans Hals. But and it's wonderful that you can actually discover how many days he spent on the Las Meninas. I think there's 4 days, and they record exactly how long these pictures took. You don't often get documentation as precise as that.
And here is Las Meninas on the left. This is, of course, Velasquez's great masterpiece, 1656. He's depicted members of the Spanish royal family as well as an image of himself at work. And you see Sargent's interpretation of this iconic painting on the right. And, he's really captured all of the sense of majesty and mystery of the original. But perhaps you could talk a bit about how Sargent's version differs. How has he sort of imprinted it with his own artistic stamp?
Of course, we're really looking at the picture the wrong way round, because this is the back scene. It's Velasquez and the visitors, the royal family, the royal couple. We should be looking with them the other way round. So it's an extraordinary kind of back-to-front picture. But you'll see it's much darker. The Las Meninas was pre-cleaning. It hadn't been restored. And so that's why the Sargent, and it's much freer than when you get up close to it, there's nothing like that. It's quite sketch-like, quite thinly done. And what Sargent's really getting to grips with is the control of light and dark. And you see the mysterious figure in the background, the side lighting, and then this great, ambiguous, mysterious space above the figures. And it's all about, the thing with Velasquez, why they loved him, was you have this feeling that there's no barrier between you and so many arts. You feel that the art is sort of artificial. You couldn't step in. You could step into that scene. That it's so real and yet at the same time so mysterious. And as I say, Sargent would have enjoyed this sort of the fact that it's you're looking at the scene the wrong way round. You should be looking at the royal couple, but he's much more interested in Velasquez and the little infanta coming to see Mama and Papa being painted.
Wonderful kind of complex spatial dynamics that he's picked up on. And I wanted to come back to a question about loans here, which I think is fun, but maybe as we're on this subject of how Velasquez and Las Meninas in particular really greatly impacted Sargent's own work, we could turn to this wonderful painting you see here from the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, The Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd, which really manifests, I think, Velasquez's influence.
It's sort of Sargent's modern interpretation of Velasquez, the four little girls in the hallway of their Parisian apartment. And again, it has this great sort of, it's the ambiguous space and the kind of echoing shadows and the mystery of, there's a counterpart to Las Meninas, is the reflection and mirror in the background. And it's all uncertain. You don't know what the relationship between the various girls are, and what their position is with this space in the background, which is sort of unknown. It's a mystery and ambiguous.
It was all because Edward Boyd was such an enlightened patron, but normally you wouldn't have a group portrait like this in which the two older girls are half hidden in the background, moody teenagers, and then the little girl looking very pleased with herself, and then the only one who seems to be at all childlike is the one on the floor with her little doll. But they seem curiously unrelated to one another. And that lovely great, the Boyds traveled everywhere with those huge great oriental vases in the background. They used to take them with them to Paris and then bring them back to Boston. And they sort of overtop the two little girls. And look at that red, that's a screen, that very important red slash on the right.
That's extraordinary. Do we know what that is? It's really, I hadn't really focused on it before, but it's almost abstract.
Well, most patrons would say that's no sort of a group. They'd have conventionally grouped the girls, all together, but he scattered them through. Somebody said it was the picture of four corners and a void.
A lot has been written about this painting, yeah, and I think that you're right, Emma, the red slash that I think is a folding screen is very abstract, and yes, as Richard mentioned, the urns, the vases traveled back and forth across the ocean. In fact, when they were acquired by the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, we're probably getting a little off topic, they discovered lots of things inside the vases. They were owned by the family and had
that the little girl had put in.
Once the girls got a little taller, maybe they stood on the ladder and put things down inside there. Anyway, it is it's a wonderful picture, and yeah.
And this painting that is in our exhibition and from your collection at the National Gallery, I think also very much reveals the influence of Las Meninas. Similarly kind of enigmatic. There's a sense of intrigue, of theatricality that I think is very much present in Sargent's work.
And that recession into space.
It's the male gaze. They're eyeing her, and she jolly well knows it, but she doesn't give a fig for that. And it's that deep recession, and Sargent isn't painting the Grand Canal when he's in Venice. He is going to these back streets, and he gets this models along with him and poses them, and Bob's your uncle, and then this great, wonderful feeling of the space, going right deep space.
And the elegance of the model, I always feel that these Venetian models look as though they're on the catwalk, but that's sort of from Velasquez, the grace and elegance of his poses, and I think we see that really throughout Sargent's career in terms of the portraiture, the real simplicity of the way he poses his figures, and as I say, this sort of grace. And you can see that in, well, this is the Velasquez on your left, and Sargent's portrait of Louise Burkhart, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, very much sort of after Velasquez. In terms of dress, it's a tribute. But also on your right, much less direct, but still very apparent that Velasquez is present in this portrait of the young Cecil Harrison. You know, the elegance of his silhouette and the sort of naturalness of it posed against a very sort of shallow and quite neutral space. That's sort of pure Velasquez, really. So it does carry on throughout Sargent's career.
Which, in a sense, was rather revolutionary for Sargent's time. It was unexpected, right, and very, and as in a way as it was during Velasquez's time, to see this simplicity of background, this loose brushwork, and then I think a lot of Sargent's patrons were probably intrigued by this new style of portrait painting, right?
Yeah, he just takes it a little too far in Madame Gautreau.
Little too simple, not quite enough cloth. And of course, Velasquez isn't the only Spanish old master who has this kind of profound impact on Sargent's work. We also see in the exhibition works by Francisco Goya and by El Greco, and here on the screen you see Sargent's copies after their work. So perhaps you'd like to speak a little bit about those influences.
Well, the picture on the left is a very small, very delicate and very beautiful study of part of a ceiling decoration with angels in a little chapel called San Antonio de la Florida, which in Sargent's day would have been outside the city walls. It's dedicated, in fact, to the man who becomes Sargent's biographer, Evan Charteris, and it's a bit like later on we might talk about the way Sargent slices his work. It's just a little section he's chosen. But the angels are they're kind of ethereal creatures, except for the one at the top, who's a bit more of a presence. And this is the El Greco is after the Holy Trinity. It's a picture in the Prado, and it shows Sargent's interest in religious art, in Spanish religious art, but also El Greco's a sort of mannerist painter, and Sargent, I think, particularly in his portraiture, is very affected by mannerism. His taste for architecture are also quite mannerist, but this kind of elongated figure of Christ, Sargent quite often elongates his figures, and the sort of twisting of the body, Sargent in Madame X, and in fact in Mrs. Hugh Hammersley, which Sarah showed, he often twists his figures so they're slightly sinuous, and it's just something a little bit different, a little bit oblique.
And the support for the work on the left is quite interesting. I think the audience might be curious to learn a little bit more about these mahogany panels that he would use sort of early in his career.
It's like cigar boxes. It's that kind of very thin mahogany board, and they were sold. They're about 13 inches by 10, and you had them slotted into their special painting boxes had these little niches, and you could just paint directly on and slot them in, and they wouldn't then, they might still be wet, the paint wouldn't have dried, but they would be protected within these little boxes. And I think he liked the direct, being able to just have these little panel there and paint, directly on. And it was, there are a lot of them, but from the very early period, he was using these panels.
Do you think, I imagine it was probably related to his, being a student. I mean, a kind of very portable thing. These boxes, you just imagine the panels one on top of the other, so if the paint were wet, the panels wouldn't touch each other, and then you pick up your box and you keep going. So I imagine it was something that he was great for its portability, perhaps a carryover or, from being a student. What I also love about these panels, in addition to what we've just been discussing, if you look at the upper left in particular and lower left of the painting on the left, it's a lot of lefts on the screen, you see how the raw surface of the mahogany panel, and these are very thin panels, is showing through and becomes part of the composition. So Sargent is using this beautiful support, whereas a work on canvas, he doesn't, sometimes you see the canvas showing through, but in these panels especially, so you're seeing a lot of process, which I think is another great thing about this exhibition, is you're seeing a lot of process, preparatory drawings for El Jaleo, architectural drawings, oil studies for the Spanish dance, that kind of thing. So to my mind, this kind of fits into that aspect of the exhibition.
And research materials, as we will see for the murals.
Right, and research
yes.
materials, yeah.
Absolutely. There's some wonderful through lines in the exhibition where you can kind of just see how he's tracing these motifs and using these different technologies in very ingenious ways. And obviously this fits very much into the narrative of Sargent as a traveler. He's carting these around. He's visiting this chapel is just outside the city center of Madrid, I think. So he's able to go there and on the spot make this work. And there are several pieces in the exhibition painted on this support,
and
type of support.
White again, Sargent love, and he loves the explosive, modernistic qualities of Goya. He's a great fan, and he loves all those violent, the prints. He's had several volumes of Goya's prints.
Yeah, this is charged with a certain amount of emotional energy, isn't it? As is, of course, the El Greco. I mean, you absolutely think of sort of expressive emotionalism, and that maybe that's not necessarily what we would associate with all of Sargent's work, but we absolutely see it in a painting like El Jaleo, which we'll turn to. Equally inspirational for Sargent, as were the Spanish Old Masters, was the influence of Spanish flamenco dance, dress, and music. And here we see these two closely related portraits of a Spanish Roma dancer from about 1879 to 80 during his first trip to Spain, extended trip to Spain. What was it about Spanish music and dance and performance in general that excited Sargent so much, do you think?
It's very raw, it's very passionate. And it's, Sargent doesn't, he certainly went to see performances, but he was very musical. He played the piano extremely well. He played quite complicated things like Albéniz, which is real virtuoso piano playing. He was very serious about music. He at one point considered giving up art, or possibly giving up art and going in for music. He was very, very committed. And he loved performance. Both in actual performance, and there is a huge sense of performance and drama in his painting. And again, I think we were talking about there's a sort of, I guess, such a grace about the way he treats these models. There's very little of the sort of picturesque incident that you see in so many studies of Spanish dancers of the period. He treats them, I think, with a great sort of refinement, which is strange because the dance itself is so raw.
I love this story of the one on the right because it says "Olé, olé, olé" all over it, and it was given to somebody called Chabrier, who's coming back into favor now, a French composer who wrote a piece called España. And Sargent was so enthralled by this piece of music that he said to Chabrier, I wanted to take off all my things and throw them into the orchestra pit. I was so excited. And he sent along the picture as a gift to Chabrier.
So it's a real link between the dance, physical object, that's a real link between the Spanish dance and music.
That's wonderful. And actually, I'll just move straight to El Jaleo, since the word olé also appears in the background of that painting, a really monumental work, kind of tour de force portrayal of a flamenco performance, But what's very interesting about it, I think, is that it has this sense of spontaneity and immediacy. We feel as though we're watching an actual, maybe even a live performance. But in reality, there was a lot of careful planning and study and fictions that sort of went into this, and we've got a series of the preparatory drawings that Sargent made for this work on view in the exhibition. He created it 2 years after his initial visit to Spain in his Paris studio, working with posed models. So maybe we could speak a little bit about the tension in his work between that sense of spontaneity and then the sort of constructed or staged or kind of crafted nature of some of the works.
Well, Sargent wanted to do a big salon picture. I mean, he was known as a portrait painter already, but he was, we saw the oyster gatherers, he was still exhibiting large-scale pictures, and he chose Spanish dance, which in a way was quite risky, because he was painting this flamboyant, modern subject on the scale of a history painting. And it's the scale of the ambition. And I think what's fascinating is the way that those earthy studies we saw in the previous slide are, as it were, they go up, they're turned into high class, high art. And the figure dancing is actually a French model, not a Roma model. And the whole scene, but again, all that work went into all those preparatory studies, but the actual painting was painted very rapidly. It's quite clear. One of the criticisms of the critics, by and large, it was one of the star pictures in the show. People were enthralled by the excitement of this dancer going across and then all the figures in the background, and it gets wilder as it goes to the right. They did, more conservative critics said, oh, it's not finished enough, it's too sketch-like, like a great sketch. And so it has all that freedom because Sargent had, through all those workings, had worked out the composition, and when it came to the painting, whoomph. That's often the way. There's much more thought. People often think, oh, Sargent just sat down and was. No, it's much more thought.
Absolutely, as you see here. I mean, I think this is a wonderful example of his very thoughtful and experimental approach to creating his compositions. You have a finished work at the left, the Spanish dance, and then his study, one of two studies for the painting in the center, and then his preparatory drawings, and such interesting shifts in the kind of palette and composition from the study to the finished work. And it's just a marvelous evocation of probably not a real scene, but something that he may have imagined or fabricated.
I think, yes, just to follow up on that a little bit, we, as part of research for the exhibition and the catalog, a wonderful scholar named Nancy Heller, who wrote about music and dance for the exhibition catalog, looked very deeply into the subject of the finished painting at the far left from the Hispanic Society to try and determine what it depicted. Is it flamenco? In 1992, exactly 30 plus years ago, when we had an exhibition called El Jaleo at the National Gallery of Art, a different scholar wrote about the painting at the left as depicting the tango. It's definitely not the tango, but when I look at this painting, I like to tell the story of all of the work that went into this exhibition and catalog, and that curators don't always have all the answers. I mean, Nancy's essay is wonderful, and she consulted many, many historians of Spanish dance, still couldn't find exactly the right answer about what's depicted in the painting. There are it's a very dark painting, but I think you can make out three pairs of dancers from left to right, the women mostly with their arms raised, the men you see it's a little more difficult, more seen in silhouette. but seems to be an outdoor scene. And are those stars that we're seeing? Are they fireworks? This led to a deep dive into the history of fireworks. Could they be fireworks? Or is this Sargent thinking about James McNeill Whistler and his nocturne paintings? It's not only mysterious in its appearance, but it's mysterious in its content and what exactly. Or is this something that Sargent imagined? We've talked a lot about this during our work on the exhibition, how Sargent did not leave behind any lists, memoirs, diaries, journals that might give us clues to the content of a painting like this, which is unfortunate, but luckily it keeps art historians employed because we can look at the objects and research them and try and figure them. And Richard and Elaine, thanks primarily to Richard and Elaine's 9-volume catalogue raisonné of Sargent's oils and watercolors. What an incredible accomplishment, published over many decades. So, anyway, important to recognize.
And while we're on the subject of kind of the behind-the-scenes aspects of organizing an exhibition, we didn't get to this earlier, but had wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about the process for securing loans. Many of you may or may not be aware of just how much work goes on in the lead up to an exhibition to get the pictures that you see on the walls here, and not exactly horse trading, but maybe.
Oh, there's plenty of that.
Plenty of horse trading, yes. Richard and Elaine and I saw Richard and Elaine have seen probably every Sargent in the world in their incredible work on this catalogue raisonné. They've welcomed me into their world for this project, and we saw a lot of objects for the exhibition. I would say maybe 75% of them together, either Elaine and I or the three of us, whether it was visiting, looking at drawings in the Harvard Art Museum or the Met that you see on the screen, seeing the painting on the far left from the Hispanic Society, and the many, many works from private collections in this exhibition that I should side note, you may never have seen them before, and you probably will never see them again until or unless they go on the art market. So we did visit collectors, curators, as I have often said, and Richard and Elaine have quite a lot of experience in this. Also, you can't just usually send a letter or an email to someone out of the blue and say you'd like to have their oil or their watercolor for 8 months. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Just the world does not work that way. So we had visits, we had coffees, we had lunches, we had cocktails, we had a lot of discussions about our exhibition. I traveled around with my laptop and PowerPoints about the exhibition, and when we couldn't meet with people personally, we had quite a lot of correspondence, and started out with a checklist 5 years ago and went from there, and we did very well in securing loans from museums and private collections in this country and in Europe and even in Australia. And I'm also happy to say that something like 98% of the exhibition that was seen in Washington is here in San Francisco. You don't always see the same exhibition at the second venue. There have been some substitutions for works on paper, so that's wonderful for you all. And seeing Emma's fantastic installation. I know Richard has more to say about loans.
Well, yeah, I think it's explaining to people how serious and ambitious the exhibition is, because I think there are a lot of what I call anthology shows, which are not necessarily throwing new light. And I think if you've got a really good subject and you explain that, this is a really original kind of exhibition, people respond to that. I think they're worried about, that just somebody wants a Sargent, a Spanish subject sort of thing. It's really persuading people that this is a serious show. But it's never, it's always it's always difficult, you know, because people are very worried in today's world,
Yes.
you know, about the dangers, and they study the insurance, the detail of the insurance. They look at much more carefully than they did, because people are, one can understand, worried by you know, putting their pictures at risk.
But no bribes, because Sarah's a government, she's a federal employee, so
That's right.
that wasn't part of the process, right?
That's right.
Oh yes, she can't speak.
Richard can bribe, but I can't.
This slide, just to point to the fact that Sargent's interest in music, and particularly flamenco, as you've said, was really not a passing fancy. It wasn't sort of a dilettantish kind of engagement. He actually had a very impressive collection of flamenco records. We've got music piping into Rosecrans, actually, you may have noticed, drawn from his sort of playlist of favorite tracks. And you see an image here of a Café Cantante in Seville. This is the type of space that Sargent would have likely seen flamenco performances in when he traveled to Spain. But yes, he was a very engaged and talented musician in his own right.
Yes, and I think what's interesting when you see this rather earthy scene of, it's just in a cafe, and then that Sargent translates that into El Jaleo. You know, he takes this and he puts it into a kind of high art context, but it comes out of these, what were called Café Cantante.
Absolutely.
You had to provide entertainment, and then your guests would stay longer and spend more on the drink.
Yeah, there's a lot of drinking happening down on the floor. So another major source of inspiration for Sargent, the Spanish dancer Carmen Dauset Moreno, known as La Carmencita. She was not actually a flamenco performer. She was trained in the Escuela Bolero, kind of similar to classical ballet. So here are two of Sargent's full-length oil portraits of her from 1890, really showing her very theatrical personality, her sort of dynamism and vitality. But she was hugely popular on both sides of the Atlantic at this time, right? He may have seen her perform first in New York on Broadway. She toured America performing with vaudeville troupes from 1889 to 1895. What do you think and also I should add that the portrait on the right, I'm getting my directions a little confused, by Sargent graced the cover of an issue of Harper's Weekly. So she was really, she had a tremendous amount of celebrity over here. And what do you think this says about sort of the status of Spain at this time in the popular imagination?
Goodness, yes. Well, as I said earlier, Spain had been kind of cut off, and so people like Carmencita had all the novelty value that, and so she's moving the dance, Spanish dance. She's taking it into the theatre and also in private homes. She was, and it's said that when she danced Sargent organized a party with Mrs. Gardner for her to dance, and then apparently all the women threw their jewels down. They were so overcome that their necklaces and their bracelets were sort of cast at her feet. So I think Spanish Spanish art, Spanish music, Spanish dance, all these things really had a novelty, the rediscovery of Spain, and then people traveled to Spain and were writing about Théophile Gautier, whose daughter was a great friend of Sargent's. I mean, he writes a great guidebook, which is very, very influential. So people are going to Spain and rediscovering it. I mean, it's extraordinary, really, when you think there was a great Spanish empire, but then it all went into steep decline. Spain, and the barrier of the Pyrenees, it was kind of forgotten place, and the fact that it were all those Islamic influences, because of course the Moorish conquerors, had occupied a lot of Spain. So anyway, that's so I think this people were electrified by Carmencita. It's very interesting here because I think the picture on the left is I think he had his first conception. He was going to show her dancing like El Jaleo. And then I think he must have thought, no, this isn't really working. And then he turned to a more classic.
Which he painted of his own volition. This wasn't a commission, which is sort of very telling, I think.
And that dress, I think, belonged to Sargent because it still survives. And he gave it to his great friend Sybil Sassoon because she liked dressing up. And it's going to appear in that dress, that self-same dress, is going to appear in an exhibition that the Boston Museum of Fine Arts is putting on next year, called Styled by Sargent. It's all about Sargent and fashion, but there's fashion and there's Sargent's fashion, and they're rather different things. Anyway,
I'm quite excited for that exhibition. We're scheming to have a reunion around
Emma
it.
and I are we're especially going to travel to London when the show goes to the Tate. And hope that's okay with you, Tom.
Yes, obviously.
But it also brings up the question of loans, just to circle back for 1 minute, because this exhibition, obviously here now through May 14th, styled by Sargent. I didn't realize that was the new title.
Rather a good title.
I'm learning something here. So that opens this fall in Boston, then travels to the Tate. And the centennial of Sargent's death is 2025, and there'll be an exhibition mostly focusing on Sargent in Paris that will be at the Met in New York and Musée d'Orsay in Paris. So you can imagine with these other major Sargent traveling exhibitions that loans have been a challenge. And Richard and Elaine, very nicely sort of at the center of a trio of curators, myself, my colleague at the Met, my colleague at the MFA Boston, we're all working on Sargent shows, and we've all had to cooperate with each other and say, okay, I would like to borrow this, but you can borrow that, but guess what?
That's mine.
That's mine. But La Carmencita is going to figure, I think, in all three of the exhibitions, so there's a sort of Venn diagram happening. But anyway.
I'm getting a little bit of a time check notification. Do we have time to kind of carry through the remainder of the slides, but more rapidly? Or, okay, you'll just kind of keep me posted. Okay, so moving on from...
We've been talking too much.
No, I think it's hard to move past Carmencita, let's be honest. So just very quickly, this was just to give an example of the kinds of views of Spain that Sargent's contemporaries were producing. William Merritt Chase on the left, popular Spanish artist Mario Fortuny on the right, very different from the scenes of Spain that we get with Sargent, right? Much more sort of picturesque.
Yes, these are very picturesque, packed with their sort of shops. When they've really all this colourful detail and their urban scenes, not like Sargent's earthy peasants and workaday Spaniards. This is much more colourful
and maybe touristic, kind of the expected view.
They're very good. I mean,
yeah, no, they're absolutely beautiful. So here we have at left a view of Camprodon. Sargent, this was his second visit to Spain after that initial 1879 trip. This was from 1892. He'd been hard at work painting portraits, traveling to the United States to start work on his mural commissions. But I think there's a wonderful tie-in with Albanese, I believe, or with music in the work on the left that you might want to speak to, or perhaps not. If not, we can move on.
Well, this is called the Calais Albanese. He was a native of Camprodon. This is in the foothills of the Pyrenees. It's a lovely little town. And he was there with his family.
an absolutely beautiful, Sargent obviously is really known for his facility with watercolor in general, and these are fabulous examples. The work on the right, I think, really gives you a sense of Sargent's experiences as a traveler. You feel like you're sitting with him in this horse-drawn carriage, clip-clopping, along the streets of Spain, and he's included this sort of left edge of the canopy here as a framing device. But that must have been really fascinating in researching this exhibition, just sort of piecing together his very sort of complex travel itineraries. And actually we have a wonderful primary source document on the left, this photograph of Sargent painting in the Court of the Lions at the Alhambra with his friend William White that actually led to your redating, I think, the painting on the right, resulting from that plein air session.
Well, someone said earlier that curators don't always know everything, and obviously cataloguers don't either. So Richard and I dated this picture on the right to 1879, to Sargent's first trip of Spain. We had found William White's diaries in Philadelphia some years ago, and looked at, I had photocopies of them all and brought them home. But then Sarah went up to with Catherine Southwick to look at the William White material and found this photograph, which is from the 1895 trip, and in which he is painting this particular picture. So it can't have been painted in 1879.
There it is on the easel in the photograph. Yeah.
So it has a new date.
Yeah. It was a fantastic day that Catherine and I had, because we went looking for something completely different in these photo scrapbooks that were maintained by Sargent's traveling companion, William White. We never found what we were looking for. Another classic story about research as a curator. Sometimes you don't find most of the time, okay, you don't find what you're looking for. But sometimes, if you don't find what you're looking for, you find something you never would have expected to find. And we found the only 5 known photographs of Sargent in Spain, not only that, but Sargent, in this case, in the Court of the Lions, painting the painting on the easel. And immediately, Catherine and I sent off a quick email to Richard and Elaine and just, wait, we think this is Sargent, it must be Sargent, can you please confirm? And you were so excited to receive these photos. Needless to say, the owner of the painting on the right-hand side of the screen was also thrilled to see his painting in a photograph of Sargent, the only one of 5 known photographs of Sargent in Spain. So it was kind of a great discovery. Literally, as our exhibition catalog was going to press, it was a stop the presses kind of moment. Let's find space in the catalog design for these photographs. So anyway.
I'm getting the real clock check here, so I'm going to just sort of zoom through some more absolutely. Yeah, please.
Just to say very quickly that was another discovery of Sarah's. This picture, we then got cold feet, because this is said to be 1879, perhaps it's in 1895, but Sarah had it x-rayed, and underneath the picture is a head of what is obviously one of the Spanish models of the early period. So, phew.
And which is absolutely fascinating. Yeah. I just wanted to touch on the incredibly fascinating influence of photography on Sargent's work that you trace throughout the exhibition. Really quite a formative inspiration for him, and he took the photographs you see on the right.
Yes, you did. We almost lost them, but that's another story. But Sargent uses this beautiful Spanish fountain. It's in the courtyard of the Hospital of St. John de Dios, San Juan de Dios, St. John of God. And Sargent uses this cropping technique, sort of thing that Degas was doing very much. He never paints the whole structure. He crops it at the top, he crops it at the side, so you get, and he hones in on a particular aspect of the fountain, so that in a sense, by seeing a fragment, you get a different view of the whole, because you're encouraged to look at it in a different way. And the issue of photography, people always ask, it's one of the most common questions, what is the influence of photography? And you can see it in technical aspects like this. But Richard, you might want to talk about the V&A photographs,
Oh,
which
yes,
is
well,
the issue of research material.
About, was it 2 years ago?
Yes, after we'd finished the catalogue raisonné, unfortunately.
After we'd finised, a colleague at the Victoria and Albert Museum wrote to us to say, we've just discovered 600 photographs that had belonged to Sargent. So we all said, well, thanks very much for letting us know. It's a little bit late, but anyway, better late than never. And the thing was, they had this distinction between fine art photographs and documentary photographs. And this cache, which were given to the museum by Sargent's sisters after his death, had been regarded as documentary, so they were distributed amongst the different departments. But the importance was that they had belonged to Sargent, and he was collecting imagery, particularly in relation to the murals, his Boston public on the story of religion, which is steeped in the imagery of Spanish religious art. He was collecting them all over the place, a lot of them Spanish subjects. And so the V&A, a very bright curator there, had got onto that, went back to the master record, and they've now been withdrawing them all from the departments and bringing them all together. They can't find some of them, but the bulk of them have now back together again. And and they're in the exhibition. There's quite a sample of particularly those processional, the religious processions of the Madonna and the dead Christ and all of that kind of thing, which were carried in. But he loved those things, and so this is another whole. It's wonderful, I think, really. Opens a door to, and it just shows what you can still discover in the cellars of museums.
Absolutely, and you see an example here. And he himself wasn't religious. Vernon Lee said he was emancipated from all religious ideas. But you've mentioned the spiritual aspect of many of his views.
Spiritual side to Sargent.
Yeah.
He didn't necessarily go in for conventional religion, but he's so private. But I think he's really immersed personally in this imagery.
Yeah, it's the individual experience, an individual spiritual experience, rather than an orthodox.
It's a matter of private conscience. Religion was a matter of private conscience, not of public worship.
If we could end here, this is sort of the last gallery of the exhibition, as it were, or if I have time to address one more subject, I can zoom back a bit. So what would you keep I'm not able to.
Can we see Emily?
I'm sorry, Maria. Do I have time to address one more question, one more slide, or should we take questions? Oh, okay. I guess the audience is egging us forward. Lovely. Well, I just wanted to mention that we see here these wonderful pictures that Sargent made during his final trip to Spain in 1912, sort of ambitious, larger-scale genre scenes, often focused on Spain's inhabitants, the Roma residents of Granada in particular. And this painting at left, Spanish Roma dwelling, shows the Roma residents of the Sacromonte quarter of Granada and the whitewashed cave that was typical of the kind of residence that many Roma families lived in and had lived in for centuries. And there's a wonderful wall text that accompanies this painting, written by a member of the Spanish Roma community, and Miguel Angel Vargas. And this is really an example of, I think, the very thoughtful way that you and the National Gallery have framed questions about Sargent's portrayals of the Spanish Roma and sort of historic representations of this group that has often been quite misrepresented. So maybe I thought you could just speak a little bit. I think that's one of the really powerful aspects of the exhibition as well.
Yes, thank you. I encourage you all, when you're in the exhibition, there are actually 4 wall texts, two each by 2 members of something called, we called it a Roma conversation group, that we convened in early 2021 at the National Gallery, had meetings over Zoom, and we located several members of the Roma community in Europe, in Spain, In particular, professors, scholars of the history and culture of the Spanish Roma in this country and in Spain. That is, the historians live in this country and Spain. So brought together a group of people who are very knowledgeable about the Spanish Roma, again, people who are Roma and people who know a lot about the Spanish Roma people and their experiences and their history in Spain. Convened this group, looked at a lot of images of the works in the exhibition. It's I don't know, maybe 10 or so oils, watercolors, and drawings by Sargent depicting the Spanish Roma, including the painting at the left. So we looked at images. We thought about whether Sargent was representing his subjects empathetically. Wanted to make sure that we were representing Sargent to the best of our abilities, being truthful about his art, but also thinking a lot about the audiences who would come to the exhibition, because for lots of reasons, to show empathy. The National Gallery's mission is to be for the nation and for all the people. We wanted to be inclusive in what we included in the exhibition, and also in how the works of art are titled. So another aspect of this was looking at the traditional titles of these works in the exhibition, not actually in any case of works in the exhibition, not titles given by Sargent. They're titles that have become associated with these works of art over time, whether from dealers or traditional descriptive titles. But some of these had included the word gypsy, which is not a word that we at the National Gallery thought would be empathetic or inclusive to use on the walls of the exhibition. So it appears nowhere in the text for this exhibition. Did not at the National Gallery, does not here in San Francisco. We settled on the phrase Spanish Roma, and it's a little bit complicated. I shouldn't go on too long because we decided as a group that that is the descriptor that we would use. And in Spain, many people we are calling Spanish Roma in this exhibition and catalog self-identify as Gitana and Gitano. So language is a different thing in different places. I had a very memorable sort of aha moment with our director, Kaywin Feldman, when we were talking about this. I had just come back from Spain. I said, Kaywin, I'm trying to figure all of this out because in Spain, Spanish people, including people that we call Spanish Roma, call themselves Gitano and Gitana, the Spanish word for gypsy. I remember Kaywin saying to me, yes, Sarah, I understand that's true, and I know that to be true. I'm sure it is true, but let's remember the National Gallery of Art is in Washington, D.C., in the United States of America. We're not in Spain, and we need to be inclusive and think about our audiences and be empathetic. So that was sort of perhaps too long of a backstory about how we asked owners of these works of art if we could shift their titles for this exhibition, titles that are in the catalogue raisonné, and we included a concordance at the back of the exhibition catalog so that people could make their research go full circle and refer to longtime titles. And that group also yielded the wall text that you'll see in the exhibition about the Spanish Roma and the four, I call them response labels or thought labels written by the two Roma members of that group, where they looked at these works of art very carefully and wrote their very own, very personal responses about the works of art. So.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we do have to end here. I'm sorry for keeping you quite a bit longer. Thank you so much for coming to be here with us today. Thank you all so much. I have too much to say.